Hey everybody, and welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching HMS Victory, the Total Guide Part 1 by Epic History TV. I am very excited to jump back into the Napoleonic Wars, and this time we're getting more of a look, presumably, at the naval warfare of the Napoleonic Wars, which will be fun because we mostly looked at the on-land exploits of Napoleon, because that is where he excelled. We didn't look at the naval battles all too much, and I think a total guide to the HMS Victory will be sort of a good way to look at that side of things. So if you guys end up enjoying this video, I'd appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. And without any further ado, let's jump into this reaction.
1805. Britain is at war with France. The French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte will soon dominate mainland Europe.
Yep.
But at sea, Britain's Royal Navy reigns supreme.
And of course, this was one of the sort of themes of the Napoleonic Wars, was the contrast between Napoleon's domination of the continent. I mean, Napoleon was the master of Europe up until the end when things started to really fall apart. But his complete lack of control of the seas. You know, Britain was the master of the seas. So France controlled the land, Britain controlled the oceans. And that was a pretty constant theme of the conflict.
That year, Napoleon wins one of his greatest victories against the Russians and Austrians at Austerlitz. But 6 weeks earlier, off the coast of Spain, the British win a battle of much more lasting strategic significance. Off Cape Trafalgar, the Royal Navy inflicts a crushing defeat on the combined fleet of France and Spain. Enemy losses are devastating. British naval superiority will not be seriously challenged again for the rest of the war.
Oh yeah.
Britain goes on to play a leading role in Napoleon's eventual defeat. Its greatest contribution, its wooden walls.
I mean, not to mention that Britain will really rule the seas for a long time to come. And if you look at the 19th century, that is really a century of Britain. You know, British imperialism is at its height, and Britain truly conquers the oceans. They really have no competitors, and they had already developed that reputation to a certain extent before the Napoleonic Wars, but their performance at sea during the Napoleonic Wars really cemented that British reputation, you know, the reputation for victory at sea.
The Royal Navy. Britain is the world's largest naval power, with 136 ships of the line and 110,000 men at sea. The Navy protects the homeland from invasion. It allows Britain to project force into Europe with raids and expeditionary forces.
Of course, and if you think about why Britain was the biggest, most important naval power at this time, you know, it doesn't really take much thinking to realize why, or why they went in that direction. Obviously, they're in a unique position from the rest of Europe. They're an island nation. And so they are connected to the rest of Europe and the rest of the world only through the sea. And so, of course, their main way to control that is through naval supremacy. And when we're talking about British imperialism, and even imperialism for the rest of Europe, how do they get around the world? Well, they have to go by ship. You know, we're not in the era of flight yet. Travel by train will become the most important travel by land, but travel by ship will remain extremely important through this whole century. And Britain will be at the top of, you know, naval warfare, travel. It'll just be a big aid to their empire.
It cuts off enemy trade while protecting Britain's own. It isolates and seizes overseas colonies, including the vastly profitable sugar islands of the West Indies. It undermines enemy economies, while allowing Britain to use its own financial strength to sustain its allies.
Yep.
In 2 decades of war with France, Britain wins a series of naval battles that ensure it can carry out these war-winning strategies effectively. Among the Royal Navy's most formidable warships, HMS Victory, a first-rate ship of the line, the most powerful class of warship afloat. 104 guns, 820 men. A single broadside from Victory packs more weight of iron than every gun in Wellington's army at Waterloo. This is Epic History TV's guide to a legendary Napoleonic warship.
Alright, I'm excited. I mean, if you know one ship from this entire conflict, it'll probably be the HMS Victory. So like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I think it is a really good way, following the journey of this ship, or giving an overview of it, will be a good way to look at the naval conflicts of the Napoleonic Wars as a whole.
This video is sponsored by Fabulous, the #1 self-care app that helps.
Very nice. Alright, so you guys know the deal. Shout out to Epic History TV. Go and check out their video, which I have linked in the description of this video. Go give them a like, subscribe to their channel, and please check out their sponsor. Show them support for making this fantastic content.
Daily routine today. The first 500 people to click on the link in our video description will get 25% off Fabulous Premium.
Very nice.
Thanks to Fabulous for sponsoring this video.
Go use that link, guys.
Today, HMS Victory lies in dry dock in Portsmouth, on England's south coast. A famous visitor attraction and the world's oldest commissioned warship.
Wow.
She's a remarkable survivor from a vanished world of sail-powered warships and global struggles between Europe's great empires.
Yeah, really a relic of a particular era. I mean, when we think about, say, early 20th century warfare, or naval warfare, we might think of the dreadnought. This is sort of the equivalent. It really shows and is really a look into this era of naval warfare and warfare as a whole.
Victory was built to boost British naval power at the height of one of these struggles, the 7 Years' War. Construction began at Chatham Royal Dockyard in 1759. She was designed by Sir Thomas Slade, the foremost British naval architect of the age. Around 6,000 trees went into Victory.
Wow.
Most were British oak, though her lower masts were originally New England pine. Her keel was elm, her upper masts...
Of course, that's, if you think of this era, the 7 Years' War, known as the French and Indian War in the United States, is of course a very important war for Europe and the world as a whole, but it is also one of the events that will directly and indirectly lead to the American Revolution. But of course, Britain still holds 13 colonies at this point, and so they're using those resources that they have access to, like timber from New England, which they will soon no longer have access to.
And yards more flexible, fir and spruce. The result, launched in 1765, was soon considered a masterpiece. A ship bristling with firepower, with the speed and handling of a much lighter vessel. Victory was not completed in time to take part in the 7 Years' War. She first saw action 13 years later in the American War of Independence.
Really?
Leading the capture of a French convoy off Ushant. When the Revolutionary Wars broke out against France, HMS Victory was the British flagship at the Allied blockade of Toulon. Then in 1797, she was Admiral Jarvis's flagship at his great victory over the Spanish at Cape St. Vincent. Victory was by then 32 years old.
Wow.
Far beyond her life expectancy of 18 years.
old, even at that point, and she will continue to see years of very important service. I mean, that's remarkable. Following the journey of this ship, like I mentioned earlier, is just a great way to follow British naval history after the 7 Years' War, because the HMS Victory was not completed in time to serve in that war, but saw service in the American War of Independence. That, of course, was a very important conflict for the Brits, and another opportunity for the French and the Brits to sort of fight it out. And then you can see the HMS Victory serving throughout the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. And it's honestly remarkable that it's, even at that point, it's already served for so long.
Worn out, she was briefly threatened with being turned into one of Britain's notorious prison ships, known as hulks. No one would have guessed that her greatest hour still lay ahead of her.
Wow,
Because
that's
of the
remarkable.
last minute, Victory was reprieved and began a major 3-year refit that cost more than she did to build.
Jeez.
She returned to service in 1803 as Vice Admiral Nelson's flagship. 2 years later, she would lead the British attack at Trafalgar.
So they refitted the ship, updated it a bit. Still surprising that its brightest hour, its fame, was yet to come, even though it had served for decades at this point.
And win her place in naval legend.
Ooh. I'm excited because, I mean, I'm not a military historian, and I particularly know very little about naval warfare, especially not about how these types of ships are built or what they consist of. So I'm very curious to learn, and I expect a lot of you will be learning alongside me, but this is completely unfamiliar.
By the Napoleonic Wars, a first-rate ship of the line was the world's largest and most sophisticated weapon of war, and it needed a huge crew to work efficiently. In 1805, Victory's complement was around 820, every man and boy with his designated role. From the admiral of the fleet to the ship's captain, naval lieutenants and marine officers, midshipmen, warrant officers, clerks and stewards, petty officers and their mates, sailors of the able, ordinary, and landlubber variety, Royal Marines, right down to the 31 ship's boys.
Wow, quite a crew. That is a lot of men. I'm honestly surprised at the amount of clerks and stewards, but I suppose we've got a lot of business to handle, a lot of stuff to organize with such a massive crew and a massive ship. I mean, you know, this is not just, you know, a captain and his crew. This is a whole operation. You know, this is a lot of logistics. So I suppose that does make sense.
Before we examine HMS Victory's arrangement and structure, a quick reminder of some common nautical terms. The right side of the ship, starboard.
Starboard.
The left side of the ship, larboard, which only became port in 1844 to reduce confusion.
I was going to say larboard does not sound familiar to me.
The back of the ship, her stern. The front, her stem. Towards the stern was aft or abaft. Towards the stem was forward or fore. Victory's middle gun deck was 186 feet long. The top of her main mast was 205 feet above the waterline.
Whoa.
Victory's top speed was 10 knots, or 11.5 miles per hour, fast for a ship her size.
That seems pretty
In
good.
1780, she received the latest British naval innovation, copper sheathing for her hull. This protected her timbers from shipworm, barnacles, and weeds, keeping her solid and streamlined. Victory, like all ships of the line, was ship-rigged, meaning she had 3 masts, a foremast, mainmast, and mizzenmast, and a bowsprit. Each mast was made up of sections. The lower mast, secured deep in the ship's hold, rose up through the decks to the fighting top, which served as a platform for sharpshooters in battle. Above it, the topmast. Then the cross trees, which secured the top gallant mast, pronounced t'gallant. The cross trees was the lookout's position, there being no crow's nests in the Navy.
Ah, interesting.
Each mast supported several yards, to which the sails were fastened or bent. Victory's rigging, 26 miles of rope and 786 pulleys in all, came in two types. Standing rigging gave structural support to the masts. Forestays and backstays kept them braced fore and aft. The shrouds secured the masts laterally, and their rope steps, called ratlins, were how you climbed the masts. Experienced seamen reached the tops by climbing the futtock shrouds.
Now it's mostly something that you climb as a child at a park. I mean, I'm sure we've all clambered up those when we were a kid. I wish I had more to add, more commentary, but like I said, all of this is completely unfamiliar to me, so I'm just sitting here trying to take it in. It's really fascinating stuff, and of course, to really give an overview of the ship, we need to understand the terminology, how the ship is structured, and I'm learning all this for the first time. Very interesting.
On a rolling sea, this could mean climbing out over the ocean upside down.
Whoa.
So novices were advised to use the lubber's hole. The other type of rigging was running rigging, used to operate the ship's yards and sails, and included halyards, bowlines, and clewlines. Victory had 37 sails with which to harness the power of the wind, her only real form of propulsion. They had a total area of 6,500 square yards, about the size of a football pitch, though not all sails could be set together, nor did more sail necessarily mean more speed. Her large square sails included the forecourse, fore topsail, pronounced topsail, and fore top gallant sail, pronounced fore t'garnsail. On the mainmast, the main course, main topsail, and main t'garnsail. The mizzen mast carried a fore and aft rigged sail known as a spanker or driver, as well as mizzen topsail and mizzen t'garnsail, while the bowsprit could carry a variety of fore and aft rigged sails, most commonly a jib and flying jib. Another 11 fore and aft rigged sails, known as staysails, could also be set. Victory's upper deck, or weather deck, was actually several decks: the forecastle, waist, quarterdeck, and poop deck. The forecastle is a shortened form of forecastle, a term dating back to the Middle Ages, when warships carried raised fighting platforms at both ends. The forecastle housed the belfry, containing the all-important ship's bell, rung regularly day and night to mark the change of watch.
Yeah, and they gave a little bit of background on that one term, but I'm sure a lot of these terms have a lot of very interesting and rather old history to them. They've emerged from different naval traditions over the years and have ended up as they are at this point.
It also housed two 12-pounder guns. All guns in this period were described by the weight of shot they fired. So 12-pounders fired a solid iron ball, known as round shot, that weighed 12 pounds, about the same as a bowling ball. The forecastle also mounted two 68-pounder carronades.
Whoa.
The carronade was another British innovation, a short, large-caliber gun, fearsome at close quarters, but lacking a cannon's range or accuracy. The beak deck gave access to the bowsprit and the head, 6 outdoor toilets for several hundred seamen and marines, which emptied straight into the sea below. The waist is where 4 of Victory's 6 boats were stowed. All large ships carried several boats. They were essential for ferrying men and supplies from ship to ship and ship to shore, for towing or turning the ship in adverse winds, and for launching amphibious attacks. The quarterdeck was HMS Victory's command centre and housed a total of 12 12-pounder guns. From here, the ship was steered using the ship's wheel. This was the responsibility of one of the ship's 8 quartermasters, assisted by his mates.
Interesting.
The ship's wheel was connected by rope to the tiller 3 decks below, which was in turn connected to the rudder. The binnacle, just 4 of the wheel, contained the ship's magnetic compasses and a lantern by which to see them. Cabins for the captain's secretary and the ship's master were located either side of the ship's wheel. Each shared their small room with a 12-pounder gun.
Yeah, I mean, if you're one of the officers or a captain, you know, you're certainly gonna have better quarters than regular sailors who lived in absolutely horrible conditions. I mean, really, truly dreadful. But no one was necessarily living in luxury. Maybe in a rare occurrence you had, you know, a captain who was living really well, though perhaps that would have been more common if they had control of their own merchant ship. But the quarters are relatively cramped for everybody, I would say. Though, like I said, the regular seamen had a much worse deal than their officers, of course.
Stern area of the quarterdeck comprised the captain's cabins, a dining room, sleeping cabin, and at the very stern of the ship, his day cabin.
See, you know what? That's actually not too bad. That's a fair amount of room. You know, that's some pretty decent quarters, I would say. Some pretty nice quarters.
All sharing space with 4 12-pounders.
Yeah, your roommates, the cannons.
The captain also had a private toilet,
Ooh,
known as the quarter gallery.
That's a luxury.
Above the captain's cabins, the poop deck, which provided good visibility and access to the mizzenmast.
Why is it called that?
It also housed the signal locker, containing the colored flags used to communicate with other ships and shore.
I mean, flags were a very important factor of naval warfare, and just, you know, ship communication in general at this point. You know, you needed to have an official flag or you might get yourself in trouble with the authorities in wherever you landed if you didn't have the flag of some country. Of course, famously, pirates would sometimes switch out flags to trick other ships to make them think they were friendly, and then, you know, knock those flags down and hoist the Jolly Roger when they launched their surprise attack. So flags were a really important form of communication. And like I said, you needed to make sure if you were an official merchant ship or a naval ship or whatever, you need to have your official state flag from whatever country or, you know, state or authority you hail from so that you can be recognized.
The Royal Navy's signals code had been recently revised by Admiral Howe. His system involved 14 flags, which could be arranged in various
Okay, interesting. So here we're seeing, I just mentioned how important flags were to communication, and I was just talking about your country or your Navy's flag, and here we see an even more complicated system of communication using different flags to mean different things.
Combinations to convey 340 messages.
Whoa.
For emphasis, a gun might be fired. At night, signaling was by pre-agreed combinations of gunfire, colored lanterns, and rockets. A Napoleonic ship of the line was, in essence, a giant floating gun battery designed to pulverize enemy warships and shore installations.
Yep.
Victory's 3 largest decks were all about her guns.
I mean, that image we're being shown right now of the ship with all its different rooms is remarkable. I mean, first off, I've been very impressed with the visuals in this video, so shout out to Epic History TV. But second off, think of the logistics present in running a ship this massive with that amount of men, those amount of rooms, the supplies, the firepower. I mean, this is a serious operation, and that's why there was so many staff on board, of course. But it truly is remarkable, the scale of everything.
as indicated.
Particularly in a time, when they were not using electricity or, steam power or any of that. They were, doing an analog style, so even more complicated.
By their name, the upper, middle, and lower gun deck. The upper gun deck housed 30 12-pounder guns, 15 on each side. Forward in the round houses was the head for junior officers, rank bringing slightly more privacy and comfort. The sick bay was located in the forward area of the upper gun deck, as it got more fresh air and sunlight than the lower decks. It was screened off from the rest of the deck by canvas partitions.
Yeah.
The surgeon's assistants, nicknamed loblolly boys for the soup they fed to patients, also slept here in their hammocks.
Yeah, you can be sure that the sick bay was generally quite full, given the spread of disease in such an enclosed environment and the terrible diets that these men were on. I would assume that the sick bay was probably quite full with very ill men constantly.
HMS Victory was a first-rate ship of the line, defined as one that carried 100 guns or more. They were the most powerful vessels afloat, and so admirals often chose them as their flagships, the command vessels for a fleet or squadron.
Makes sense.
Several renowned British admirals took Victory as their flagship at various times, including Earl Howe and Earl St. Vincent. The most famous, of course, was Viscount Nelson.
Yeah, I mean, the other two are not remembered that much among the general population these days. History buffs will still be familiar with them, or those who are generally familiar with the history of this era. But, of course, Nelson is a bit of a British hero still to this day. He's still quite well known and remembered for his victory at Trafalgar. So he is well remembered among the British population.
Admiral required his own suitably grand quarters, located in the stern section of the upper gun deck. These comprised an anteroom and a dining room, which also served as a meeting room. In the sleeping cabin, the Admiral usually slept in a suspended cot, but Nelson preferred a campaign bed like this one, easier to get in and out of with only one arm. At the very stern lay the Admiral's day cabin, which served as his office and private space.
Yeah, so, obviously, if you're the Admiral, your quarters are going to be... These are some of those uniquely good quarters I was talking about. This is about as good as it's going to get. And, of course, he's the guy, so he has to be living well, even on a ship like this, but... when you see the quarters of the regular crewmen, you'll be thinking, wow, and the Admiral's quarters took up that much space. And, you could have used some of that space to fit a little more space for your regular sailors. Of course, that's just not how it was. But, if you're a regular seaman, let's just say you were a bit more cramped than this.
The Admiral would spend much of his day here, submerged in the meetings, paperwork, and administration required in the running of a fleet.
Yeah.
The Admiral's cabins, like all cabins on the gun decks and quarterdeck, were formed by removable wooden panels. This meant when a ship cleared for action before battle, the cabins could be rapidly dismantled and carried with furniture and personal items down into the hold.
Huh.
The purpose of this was to allow the gun crews to work their guns without obstruction.
Oh, interesting.
The middle gun deck housed 28 24-pounder guns. Heavier guns were lower in the ship for greater stability. The ship's galley, a kitchen and giant iron stove, was where the ship's cook and his mates prepared meals for the crew.
Yum.
The stern section was known as the wardroom, where commissioned officers dined and slept. At night, around 300 sailors and marines slept on this deck, their hammocks strung up between the guns.
Yeah, if you're just a regular guy on the ship, you're not a commissioned officer, you're not the admiral, then this is how you're going to be living. Certainly not fine living. Not that great. You probably want to be off as soon as possible. Not to mention when you're cramped in so much, like I referred to earlier, the speed at which disease spreads is pretty remarkable. So not healthy, spacious, clean, or comfortable quarters. If that's what you want, then this is not the place for you.
The deck below was the lower gun deck. This housed the Victory's heaviest guns, her 32 pounders. And at night, more than half the crew, around 460 men, slept here.
Jeez.
This plan of HMS Bedford, a contemporary third-rate ship of the line, shows how crowded it could be below decks.
Yeah.
This far down in the ship, gun ports were usually kept shut because they were close to the waterline. With little fresh air and so many men living down here, the smells of the lower gun deck could be notoriously challenging.
Yeah, that's nasty.
The stern area, separated by canvas screens, was known as the gun room.
I mean, when you see the conditions that these men lived in, not to mention the treatment that they received, it's no surprise that there was a lot of piracy around this era. I mean, the height of piracy, or at least European piracy, was probably more in the early 1700s, late 1600s. There's a lot more piracy at that point. But considering the conditions, it's not surprising that you might be like, you know what, screw this. I'm becoming a pirate. This is terrible.
This was where warrant officers dined, with screened-off sleeping quarters for the master gunner, chaplain, and 2 junior lieutenants. They shared the gun room with the ship's tiller, a large wooden beam connecting the ship's rudder to the ship's wheel via a series of ropes and pulleys. The tiller is not currently in situ, but the strip of canvas marks its position. The beam would swing through the room when the ship turned, so anyone dining in the gun room was wise to mind their head. Below the lower gun deck was the orlop deck, a warren of small cabins and stores beneath the waterline, lit only by lanterns.
Damn.
The forward section contained storerooms and cabins for the bosun and carpenter. The more open area by the main mast was known as the cockpit, fore and aft. The midshipmen berthed and messed here, but in battle it became the surgeon's operating theatre.
Whoa.
At the Battle of Trafalgar, after Vice Admiral Nelson was shot on the quarterdeck by a French sharpshooter, he was carried down to the orlop. Victory's surgeon was unable to save him, and this is where he died.
Jeez.
Off the aft cockpit lay a series of cramped compartments, including personal storerooms for the captain and first lieutenant, the steward's room for issuing rations brought up from the hold, the surgeon's cabin and his dispensary, and various other cabins and storerooms. Forward and aft, hanging magazines held ready-made cartridges for the guns sent up from the main magazine.
I mean, it's obviously a large ship, but it's still, I would say, pretty impressive the amount of stuff that they were able to fit into this space. I mean, it was really, I don't know if I used the word optimized, but everything was really packed in there, right? Including the people. I mean, it was a floating community of, hundreds and hundreds of men. So you're going to need the stuff that hundreds and hundreds of men will need to live. And all of that is packed onto their ship. Now, of course, you're not going to have any of the luxuries of the land, nor any of the cleanliness, or, I can't imagine the medical care was all too good in a situation like this, but you are going to have the essentials. And even that is a pretty crazy thing to think about.
The orlop deck was surrounded by a passage known as the Carpenter's Walk, which
particularly, and I was kind of implying this, but to put it explicitly, not only is this a community of 800 men, but this is also, a military. So you need all the things that hundreds of men will need to live, plus all of the supplies needed to wage war. That's the other half of it. And that's what makes it even more remarkable.
Gave the carpenter and his mates easy access to the ship's hull to plug any leaks. At the very bottom of the ship lay the hold, around 50,000 cubic feet, holding provisions for up to 6 months at sea. It was lined with 257 tons of iron ballast to keep the ship stable. This was covered by 200 tons of shingle, additional ballast, which provided a stable bed for the ship's 150-gallon water casks. These alone weighed roughly 300 tons at the start of the voyage. Other barrels contained 50 tons of salt beef, 50 tons of salt pork, and 45 tons of ship's biscuit. Various storerooms below contained items such as flour, spirits, tar, and paint. The shot locker contained 100 tons of iron shot. Last but not least, the most vulnerable part of the ship, the Grand Magazine, holding up to 35 tons of gunpowder in 784 barrels.
Yeah, you do not want an accident to happen down there, or your ship is going kablooey. Yeah, that is... I mean, they have to store it somewhere, but obviously that is a dangerous situation.
A fire here would cause an explosion that obliterated the ship and anyone aboard.
I'm sure.
Or if water got in, the gunpowder would be useless in battle. Therefore, elaborate precautions were taken to keep the magazine safe, including fire doors, fire-retardant plaster walls, copper sheathing to avoid sparks, and keep out moisture and rats. The forward section of the magazine was the filling room. Here, loose gunpowder was scooped from this powder bin into cloth bags to make cartridges for the guns. Lanterns were kept safely behind glass in an adjacent light room. Until required, ready cartridges were stored in racks on either side of the filling room. In an age before steam or electrical power, all the ship's heavy lifting had to be done by manpower.
Yeah, I mentioned the lack of electricity and steam power earlier, but when they were describing all of the storage down at the bottom of the ship, I was just thinking about how much of an absolute hassle it would be to move any of this up to the top, to the deck. If you're, a sailor on this ship, or on any ship, you're probably a pretty strong guy. I mean, your job involves a lot of physical labor, but even so, think about how exhausting some of this would have been, having to move these barrels or any of the supplies all the way up through this complicated maze, moving up several different stairwells, or maybe they had pulleys to bring it up. Either way, that's going to take a lot of strength and a lot of effort.
Mechanical assistance came from 2 capstans, the main capstan and jeer capstan. These were effectively giant winches, which extended vertically through the middle and lower gun decks. To turn them, bars were inserted into the capstan head, with up to 10 men pushing each bar.
Jesus. So, of course, like I said, it's not quite a pulley system, but it is a mechanical system to move things up. But even so, look at the incredible amount of manpower that would have taken. That would have taken some heavy pushing from every single man there, who, like I said, would have been pretty strong, though. If you think about how terrible their diets were and terrible their health was, it's pretty remarkable that they could even put up that measure of strength, honestly.
Using both decks, this meant 260 men were working the capstan for the heaviest jobs, such as raising the main anchor or hoisting a gun.
Wow.
The work was often accompanied by a fiddler, a shanty, and the stamp of feet.
Well, there you go. You don't need calories in you if you have a good sea shanty going. That certainly motivates all the men. I'm sure we all love a good old-fashioned sea shanty.
Victory carried 7 anchors in total. The heaviest, the best bower anchor, weighed 4 tons and was rigged at the starboard bow. The small bower anchor on the larboard side was only slightly smaller. Sheet, kedge and stream anchors served as spares and for keeping the ship stationary in small harbours or rough weather. All wooden ships leak at sea, even before hulls are split by cannonballs or hidden reefs. Victory had 4 crank-operated chain pumps, which could pump water out of the ship at approximately 1,300 gallons per minute.
Wow.
About 300 jerry cans worth. She also had 2 elm pumps for pumping seawater into the ship for washing and putting out fires. In the late 18th century, HMS Victory and ships like her were the most sophisticated and advanced machines in the world.
Oh yeah.
Massive floating batteries that could remain at sea for 6 months or more and traverse the globe. In the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, they battled for naval supremacy.
I mean, it is a real projection of power. I mean, we still see ships like aircraft carriers being used for that today, but bring ourselves back to this era, having such a massive warship with so many supplies able to stay out at sea for so long, so much firepower. If you send that, you know, sailing around European waters, that is quite a projection of power, and quite a projection of influence. And that is certainly what Britain would use it for in the coming century, projecting their power and influence around the entire globe. And it certainly worked.
Most dramatically in giant fleet actions. It was a contest that Britain won decisively. The consequences for Napoleon were disastrous.
Yeah.
But for all Victory's qualities, it was not ship design that gave Britain the edge in the war at sea. It was the men who sailed her. British commanders and crews were experienced, capable, and aggressive. In the next video, we'll see how they sailed and fought a ship like Victory. And how they lived aboard her.
I'm very interested. I'm very curious to get the information on that, because I do know a little bit about life at sea, but my knowledge is primarily of the early 1700s and late 1600s. I've done a bit of research on the golden age of piracy, which sort of covers that era, particularly the post-War of Spanish Succession era. So I'm very curious to see how things have evolved almost 100 years later, how life at sea was, the conditions, the treatment. I'm very fascinated to learn about that next time.
Our deep thanks to the National Museum of the Royal Navy and HMS Victory for their help in making this series.
That's
Victory
great.
is now embarking on an exciting new phase of her long and dramatic history. A major 10-year conservation project to ensure her survival far into the future. The work is guided by the latest scientific and historical research and will involve removing and replacing rotting timber and other structural repairs. And the great news is that the ship remains fully open to visitors throughout. Visit during the project, and you'll even get to see conservation work up close, with expert shipwrights on hand to explain what's happening. For more information and bookings, please visit historicdockyard.co.uk.
All right, yeah, that's a great collab there. You know, I'm glad they're obviously doing preservation work. It's just really incredibly important to keep any historical artifacts, buildings, ships, anything of the sort, any historical material we have preserved to the best of our ability. And I'm glad Epic History TV was working with the National Museum on this one. That's really great. You know, I can't go visit. I'm not really in the area, but if you guys can, that sounds like a fantastic, you know, opportunity. So yeah, this was an interesting video. apologies for, I feel like, sort of a lack of commentary on this one. I mean, I gave some commentary, but like I said, I really don't know too much about this topic, so I was really learning, but I think that's valuable too. Looking at a topic I really don't know anything about and sort of learning about it along with you guys. I mean, that's sort of part of what this channel's about. So yeah, I had a good time with this one. If you guys enjoyed this one, I'd appreciate it if you would subscribe to my channel, leave a like, and check out the Patreon, which is linked down below. I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.